Welcome to this module on Azure architecture and compliance. We're going to take a deeper dive into the overall architecture of Azure and what is going to be called your tenant. We want to give you these groundings so that you have in other modules as we dive deeper into Azure Resource Management and Identity Management, you're going to have an overall landscape. Now this is going to be done infrequently for organizations, usually done once at the start and possibly reviewed on a regular basis, maybe once a year or every several years. We've got a number of the objects we want to take a look at inside of your Azure architecture. I talked about this hierarchical structure starting at the very top of we're going to take a look at different types of Azure. Believe it or not, there's more than one. So public Azure is the one that most people are going to be using. And below that, you're going to then take a geography. You then get into a thing called a tenant. All of these terms, you'll see how they all piece together, but this becomes the landscape in which you're going to have what I'll refer to as your governance plane. And so where do you assign controls of permissions and governance adherence to company policies or even government regulations that you may have? So you're going to take a look at down the left-hand side, each one of these in detail specifically. When we take a look at Azure itself, inside of public Azure is a variety of regions. Now before I go here, I'm going to jump to the whiteboard and I'm going to go jump back and forth as opposed to doing a full whiteboarding session. I'm going to jump back and forth so you can see where these pieces come into play. So I'm going to jump back and forth between a couple of these concepts as I've described. So what you're seeing on the screen is an architectural picture of all the pieces we're going to put together. I'm going to deconstruct this in a minute and put it back together over this next recording. But what you're seeing is public Azure. That's what most people are going to use. That's what we're going to be using in the description. And it has a global capability. Now I'm going to refer to this as N. If any of you are familiar with version control, it has the most recent, most current features that are being deployed across Azure. And instead, it's what most people are going to use. We also have a variety of what are called sovereign clouds. Now, currently at the time of this recording, there are 3 of them with considerations for more. These are complete separate installations of Azure, physical locations, and I'll refer to this as N-1. What we have to do is, one of the sovereign clouds is for the US federal government. You'll often hear the term called Fed or FedRAMP. And so it is a completely separate iteration of Azure that has gone through specific security compliance requirements to meet the federal government. Now, if you're a federal, state, or local government within the United States, you potentially have the option to deploy some or all of your Azure resources to meet compliance requirements into that sovereign cloud. Instead, at the time of the recording, we've got one in Germany and one for China. Now, why we call it N-1 is some features, before they can be deployed into Azure, must go through a compliance check at this federal level. And so it may not have the features that are available in public Azure that won't be available in the sovereign cloud until it goes through that compliance check. So know that the general line that we use is not all features are available instantaneously in all of the cloud versions you're dealing with. Now we're going to take that out, not really deal with it much in this class specifically. And then the third one, I used to be part of the product group, a feature called Azure Stack Hub. This is an implementation of Azure that you can actually put in locations of your choice. I did work for a large oil and gas organization that we were putting these things into the oil rigs off of the Gulf of Mexico. And so what happened is, they couldn't have storms go through and lose their internet connection to the cloud. They needed to be able to have local backup and capabilities so that they could be autonomous. And so using this Azure Stack Hub, it allows to run Azure Cloud Services in a potentially disconnected state. And then when connections come back, they can hybrid. We've put them on cruise ships and a wide variety of other options. But just a couple of different versions of Azure, not really part of the course, but I thought it was worthwhile telling. Now, when we take a look at public Azure, I'll try and zoom in a little bit more, we then come into geographic regions. And so you can deploy your tenant to a geography. And so your Entra ID tenant will reside in that geography. So you may have requirements for things like GDPR or maybe HIPAA. You may have government regulation requirements. So you may actually decide which geographic region to deploy your tenant. Now this might be also a reason to have more than one tenant. Now, as a general rule, Microsoft recommends that you start with one tenant. It should meet most people's needs and requirements, and you'll see why as we go through in a few minutes through this hierarchical structure. Now, if you need more, I wouldn't go too many. I would say start with one. Maybe if I need more than one, maybe have one in Europe and then one in North America here. So grow as requirements are going to have been defined for you to meet that requirement. Inside of that geography, you then get into a tenant. This is a global service. If I jump over here, at the time of this recording, this is a map of what our global services look like. There's a website, we'll put the link on the screen, that if you want to go take a look at, it's a dynamic map. The screen floats around. You could zoom in on the specific regions. Taking a look at the legend on the left, you can see that there's a wide variety of different services, and I want to focus on what are regions that are available now. So we're going to take a look at regions as we go through this. It's the first slide that I was on when I jumped here. So at the time, I believe it's 67 regions currently that we have globally. And so you can deploy through public Azure across these 67 different regions, with more coming all the time. Now, it's not in the course, but if you need to have more than one tenant, we have a new feature called Azure Lighthouse. I talked about your governance plane, and why you typically want to have one tenant is that becomes your governance plane. I've said in other recordings, and it's a kind of a default thing you should remember, child objects inherit things from their parent. It's kind of a general statement. In a security module, I talked about child objects, whether they be files or folders. They inherit things, permissions, from their parent. You're going to see that play true in this recording, where we're going to take a look at the child objects that we're going to now cover in this module. Will inherit things from the hierarchical structure. So we start with the tenant as the highest level, and there are permissions, and we're going to take a look at things called policies and tags that will then start to be inherited down through the two administrative planes inside of your tenant. In a previous recording, we at length covered about identity management, and we took a look at this thing called your directory tenant in the name of Microsoft Entra ID. I'm not going to cover any of that. That's been done at length. Once you have an identity that has been authenticated, we then need to control access to objects, what is called authorization, or RBAC, the role-based access control. You will have your identity validated through Entra, and then you will use your authorization model to manage your resources throughout your tenant. Now, let's say if you had, I'll call this company number 2, maybe you bought a new division through acquisition. I need to be able to somehow tie these two together, not from a directory perspective, because if you watch that recording, we talked about how you can have a business-to-business relationship between the identities. But what happens from our resource management and these things of inheritance of permissions, RBAC, tagging, policies? This is where a feature called Lighthouse is going to provide some of that central management. It's a relatively new feature inside of Azure. Before, this used to be quite difficult, and if you had multiple tenants, there was a manual process that you had to overlay and try and get the governance consistent across all of your tenants. Again, not part of this course, but it is a feature that now has come in that evolving control plane management inside of Azure. Now, what you're going to see throughout the rest of the slides, and I'll come back and forth, we're going to take a look at this hierarchical structure of things called management groups. There's two types we're going to take a look at: the tenant root management groups, and up to 10,000 management groups that you can add in up to 7 layers deep. Now, the books will either say 6/7, 6 or 7. It says it differently at different places. You will always have a tenant root management group. It's there by default. You have it. So that's number 1. You have the ability to add up to 6 more levels deep, and you can go as wide as you want for up to 10,000 groups. So you have quite a significant amount of administration from an organizational perspective that you could map to your organization using this flexibility. Now then, in this hierarchy, you can set permissions. Maybe you have production versus test, Very simple. Maybe you have something in Europe versus North America. Maybe you got something on the West Coast versus the East Coast. Maybe you've got sales versus admin. All of this can be mapped out to the organizational structure using the management groups with these 10,000 at 7 layers deep. We're then going to take a look at a billing construct that you could manage resources from a financial perspective using this thing called subscriptions. You got multiple subscriptions that will then be assigned to a management group and then inherited down through, and I'll show this in a live demo that I'll be doing, where we'll show you can assign a management group a subscription and then have all of its child management groups inherit that billing construct. Below a subscription, we then get what are called resource groups. We're going to dive into all of these features over the course of this recording. Now, I want to go back into this concept of Azure being a global resource with multiple regions. This is a picture of what US East looked like back in, this is what it looked like in 2014, and this is what was added in 2017. So in 3 years, each one of these is what you would call a data center. It has independent internet connections. It has redundant power capabilities. It has redundant, heating and cooling, all the resources. So each of these data centers become what are called a fault domain. They become a single point of failure that if you lose that data center, what happens to the resource? But you're seeing that this region is significantly large and continues to grow. So think about the almost 10 years since 2017. Think what's happened to this region. So this is the term that we refer to as a region. You have data centers in the region, and then inside of those data centers, we have that traditional rack structure that you're working with. So think of that diagram that I showed you, that the Azure region, we'll use US East here, is a single region with multiple data centers that are in it. Imagine inside of that data center, we then have what we call scale units. And these become the single point of failure, often referred to, and I'll use the term when we get into things called scale sets and availability sets, a single point of failure, or a term called a fault domain. A fault domain has a TOR, top of rack switch, and a PDU, power distribution unit, that provides redundant power to all the nodes inside of this fault domain. The top of rack switches provide redundant connectivity to the top of rack switch, meaning that if you lose the TOR or you lose the PDU, and these are connected redundantly into the power, and these are redundantly connected into the backbone of Azure. So I have a single point of failure that says, what happens if I lose one of these? I potentially am going to lose access to the resources that are deployed to one of those nodes. So a region has multiple data centers. Inside of the data centers, we have these things called scale units that then provide redundancy so that if I do lose a scale unit, I'm going to be able to deploy resources potentially redundantly across multiple fault domains. This is going to come up in another recording when we talk about availability zones, availability sets, fault domains. All of this is going to come up, as I said, in other recordings, but you just want to understand the structure. We have a region, we got a data center. Now within a region, you might actually have multiple data centers. So I've marked this as AZ1 or availability zone 1, availability zone 2, and availability zone 3. But for all intents and purposes, these are data centers. And what we now do, and this is managed by Microsoft, we are going to say, gosh, Bob, it was great that you had the ability to have multiple fault domains inside of a data center, but what happens if the entire data center goes down? It would be redundantly across 3 potential fault domains, but if I lose the data center, I'm going to lose access to my resource that I'm working with. So this is going to give you the capability to have multiple data centers that you could put this across. Now I'm going to come back here and show you how this plays out. So I'm going to have green user here that has availability zone 1, 2, and 3. Now it's not just one data center. You can see that there's multiple data centers across this entire region. So at Microsoft's control, maybe this data center is 1, this one is 1, this one is 1, this one that's being built is 1, this one up here is 1. This one might be 2, this one here might be 2, this might be 2, and this one might be 2. This one's 3, we got a 3, we got a couple of 3s up here, got a 3. So all the data centers are going to be mapped out to an availability zone that is unique, in this case, for green user. I then have blue user. They too have availability zones of 1, 2, and 3, but theirs might be 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1. This might be 2, this might be 2, and this one might be 3, 3, 3. So managed by Microsoft, we will then deploy across the entire region. That way, if you lose a data center, you're going to have this redundancy across zones within the data center. Now, there's pros and cons to anything. And I often tell people, anytime I give you something, I'm taking something away. And it's usually either money, resources, or time. Now, what happens is, I hope you'd understand that if all the resources are in the same data center, they're very close to each other. And in many cases, they're connected by fiber optic cable. The connection between the fault domains within the data center is almost instantaneous. And you'll see this come up in other recordings. The published latency across a region is less than or equal to 2 milliseconds. So if you had a resource, maybe it's a virtual machine that's deployed across the region, across multiple zones, that latency to communicate between them would be less than 2 milliseconds, which is screaming fast, but it is something you might want to consider, that if you can't have a 2 millisecond latency, how's that going to impact your application? You might want to take these things into consideration. Outside of the tone of the class, but it's something I want to bring up. So we have regions, we have global regions. Within the regions, we have these data centers. Within the data centers, they're broken up into these availability zones. Now, there's a whole nother level of complexity that Microsoft provides that would be extremely hard for you to be able to replicate. I'm going to zoom in on this map into North America. Now, we talked about US East, and then we have US West too. Inside of a geography, to meet governance and compliance requirements, we showed you that you could have a zone redundant across 3 data centers inside of US East. We just talked about that. But what happens if the entire region were to fail? We have a feature called a region pair, where Microsoft will manage the replication and the failover capabilities to a region pair of Microsoft's choosing. You don't get to pick to it. So in this example, US East is paired with US West. This is East 1. There's another one here called East 2. We'll call this one West. And we have West 2. So US East is paired with US West. US East 2 is not paired with US West 2. And here's the reason why. We actually have some data centers in the central. So I've got Central 1. East 2 is paired with Central. And the reason we do this is, you may or may not know, there are 3 different power grids in the United States. There's west of the Rockies, east of the Rockies, and for all intents and purposes, Texas, that central region. So what we're providing for you is fault tolerance at a power grid level. So if you deploy your resources onto East and East 2 and you pair them, you're going to be able to have potentially 2 power grids go down. So let's say the West Coast goes down, the East goes down, so East and paired with West would go down, but you would still potentially have the central zone as its redundant capability being paired with East 2. Now, I often get asked the question, well, Bob, what happens if all 3 power grids go down? And I jokingly reply, well, you've got other problems to worry about, like zombies walking the face of the earth, than worried about trying to get your data center back up. But, try and think of how you could potentially do this yourself in the old legacy on-premises world. these are some of the great capabilities that manage at only the scale that Microsoft can do, and other cloud potential providers. But we're managing this at a level that would be hard for individuals to be able to work with. Now I'm going to go back to the slides. We're going to show you some of these topics and then come back to this whiteboard and see how they play into the overall architecture. So coming back to the course content, what you're seeing is that description I just talked about. They skipped over the sovereign clouds as well as the private clouds using Azure Stack Hub, and they're showing a lot of these concepts that I showed to you, the availability zones inside of a region. We saw that there's this region pair inside of a geography, and why they do that is what's called data sovereignty. You don't want data that is sovereign, required to stay in a legal jurisdiction in in the United States, for my example. You want it to replicate only to other US locations. We've got them in Canada, we've got them in different European regions, so those region pairs are managed by Microsoft. We've got great documentation that talks about this, and there's other failover capabilities that we're not talking about. We're just introducing the topic here. We talk about how it provides scale capabilities and fault-tolerant capabilities that you're working with. And where you want to deploy these, it talks about deploying them closest to where the users are going to be from a global perspective. Again, I can have one tenant that might be tenanted from a tenant perspective inside of the United States, but it can deploy resources around the globe at those 67 and growing number of regions. So you can manage this at a global scale. We then get into that component. Now they've skipped over, it's going to be 2 slides on. They're going to skip over the management groups, but they've gone right to subscriptions. And subscriptions are a billing construct. You can have one subscription for your entire organization. And what it will then do is, by default, remember, if these were management groups and you put a subscription at this top level, it would then be inherited by all of its down groups. Within that management group, you then have resource groups. They would inherit things from their parent object. So if a subscription is assigned to the Azure account, it could then be inherited. I could then have another subscription. I could have a purple subscription. I could have a blue subscription. And that would only be available to that management group and its down channel or child objects that you're working with. Now, billing typically happens on a monthly basis that you're working with. We'll take a look at the different types of subscription. There's a pay-as-you-go. But if you have one of the enterprise licenses that you're working with for a subscription, you would get that bill on a monthly basis, and so you could allocate it to either a geographic region, maybe a department that you're working with. But we're going to also show the other ways that you can do this using features called tagging, where you could put a cost center so that all of these different resources may report back to a single subscription. But if I need to partition some of that information from one customer or one cost center to another, I could actually take that subscription and then be able to divide its bill up based around an attribute like a tag that you could then say, what is the cost center for that subscription? So lots of capabilities and complexities to be able to manage the cost features. So again, that's where I would say subscriptions are a billing construct. Where management groups, we're an organizational structure to be able to take your organization and break it up into maybe different divisions. If I think about an automotive organization, they have different brands. They got their luxury brand, they've got their commercial brand, they've got their truck brands. Maybe you want to break your organization up that way inside of a single tenant as opposed to having different tenants for them. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. This is in the books. It's going to talk about the different types of subscriptions and the ways that you can get them. For the vast majority of our customers, they probably have some enterprise agreement relationship with Microsoft, and so they're going to have that subscription. But as an individual user, I've used some of my tenant information previously. I could back that with a credit card, so it's billed as a pay-as-you-go. We have certain free accounts that are available where if you wanted to, you could sign up for Azure and get a certain cash allotment that will then be burned down over the use of that will last potentially up to a year. So a wide variety of ways to be able to get your subscription. Now, you might want to remember this. I talked about some pro tips potentially for the exam. You might want to understand the different types of billing. An exam question might be based around what kind of subscription would you use if you wanted to pay as you go just for those resources as opposed to a monthly billing structure. So know the different types of bills. Subscriptions are going to be based around, as I said, you can get a free subscription by just going to azure.microsoft.com, and then there's an option to get a free subscription. You could actually then turn that into a pay-as-you-go by giving it a credit card to back it. You can have an enterprise agreement where you're going to be coming to Microsoft, and through that relationship with us, you're going to be able to create subscriptions. Or you can come to cloud solution providers, partners of ours, that are taking our solutions and usually bundling it together with a series of either services or management capabilities or some software that they've provided that they will then give you the subscriptions to bill that too. So a wide variety of ways to be able to create that billing structure. Resource groups in that hierarchical structure, from management groups down to subscriptions down to resource groups, are a way to group resources. Now, they've done a pretty good job on the slide describing kind of the two extremes that you're working with. Now, I'm going to go back to the bottom one here, which might be that traditional way of grouping things together. All my networking stuff could be in a resource group. All my SQL stuff might be in a resource group because I'm going to give that management to my SQL people so they can manage all the SQL servers. Now, that is what I would call typically a legacy way to manage this. What you might want to do is to take a look at a more of a modern way to do this, and Microsoft's recommendation is to now group resources together based on a common life cycle. So these objects that get created together, gets consumed together, they get managed and updated together, and usually through to destruction or retirement, they share a common life cycle. And so what you're going to do is to put the solutions together that share that common life cycle so that they can be managed as a collective unit. Now, there's different ways to do this. Maybe they share a common life cycle because they're in a geographic region, and you have a global application, and that allows your application to grow. So maybe you start here in North America, you've got all the resources, whether it be SQL and networking and databases, and you've got storage uses, and you've got some PaaS services. They're all in a resource group. Now, when you expand to Europe, you might want to create those same resources, but now have them in Europe managed by a different group. So as you can grow around the globe, might be one way to do that. You might even have a multi-tiered application that shares a common database backend with other applications. In that case, what I might do is put the front end and middle tier components of that application in one resource group because they share a common life cycle. And if I grow to other regions, I might put those regions' resources in a resource group that share the common data backend in a third resource group because they don't share a common life cycle. Because you could potentially get rid of those two applications in the two regions, but the data might still be needed to be used for other parts of an application that don't share the destruction life cycle of the old application that was using that data. So different ways to work with resource groups. The general rule would be to find objects that share a common life cycle and put them into that common resource group. There is a feature, and we're going to take a look at this, called resource providers that are assigned at the subscription level. I'm going to do that in another recording. But the other things that we have are service limits and quotas that are typically assigned to a resource or a subscription. And so as there are some that are enforced by Microsoft, or you can put your own controls around these objects. So you can put limits so that they just don't run away on you and be potentially surprised by a pretty significant bill. So take a look at the abilities to control costs, not just by the subscription itself, but by putting quotas around resources and how much they can consume of it based on a billing construct that you might want to enforce. So seeing how this all plays together, we've got that hierarchical structure. We talked about the management group. There's the tenant root management group at the very top of this that falls right below your tenant. That's there by default. You can rename this now. So you can use that as the starting point. And here's where you're going to be able to build up to 7 layers deep, 10,000 management groups to build the organizational structure that you're working with. I then can take my billing construct of subscriptions, and remember the child objects. So in case this subscription was assigned to this management group. So I would say it was assigned here. So this is now used by these three management groups. It is also available to the management group of apps because it's a child object of a parent, in this case HR, and HR has access to the EA billing, so all child objects inherit stuff from their parent. Now taking this to the extreme, this EA subscription is assigned to root, so it's now available to IT, which is available to production, which is available to GO1 and GO2, that also have their own subscription. So in fact, this has two subscriptions, the EA plus the enterprise agreement subscription available to it. So there is that complex way of being able to split it off. And if I wanted to have the EA bill come in on a monthly basis, because it's going to come from all of these management groups, I need to be able to distinguish which management group got it. So maybe I'm going to put a tag for what is the management group and the name of it. So when that bill comes in, it'll be for all the resources. I could filter that bill for, I want to know the resource that was tagged to the HR management group versus the IT management group, and you could then separate that bill at that level. Here's that feature of tagging. Tags, you can have up to 50 tags per object. You can have hundreds of tags in general. So you can put tags on resources, you can put tags at resource groups, you could put tags on subscriptions. And so if I had a tag, so I could have up to 50, I could have one for cost center, I could have an owner tag, and this is what's called a name value pair. So cost center 01157, the owner is Bob. I can only have one tag of one type. Now I'm going to do this in the demonstration. Be very careful. Depending on permissions, and you can control this, what is the difference between cost center as two separate words versus cost center as one word? I'll do this as the demonstration. They're both cost center, but I can have both on the same attribute. Which one is the one that you want? Now, you want to be following a naming convention because maybe you've got one for production. You maybe have one for prod. Are they the same type of tag? But if you're just letting people kind of willy-nilly create the tags, you want to make sure that they're following this structure so that we just don't get this random naming of tags on objects. But a single object can have up to 50 of those tags. And again, I'll be doing this as a demonstration in a few minutes. This comes up later, but in addition to tags, there's two other objects. One is called locks and policies. I like to deal with all three of them typically at once. And you typically want to tag something so that potentially a policy applies to it, and you might want it to be locked. So you're going to see this over a series of different points, but very similar to what tags are, we're going to see in an example, you can build tags, assign objects to them. You're going to also be able to have these locks and policies go with them as well. We saw how this is going to allow for cost management. I'll do a demonstration of the costs that you can now get into and see the billing as it's coming up. The bills come out if you're using the enterprise agreement way of billing a subscription. Comes out on a monthly basis. But if you can get near real time, and I don't say it's not 100% real time, it's about 5 to 15 minutes out from the actual billing cycle of the resources that are consuming it. But you could, in near real time, be able to drill down and see at a variety of different levels, right down to the resource level, to a resource group level, be able to identify the cost structures that you're working with. Okay, so we've introduced you to a wide variety of objects inside of Azure that you can now create to provide governance and compliance around. Let's go off to a live demo where I'm going to go off and show you this in the portal. So I want to demonstrate some of these concepts to you in the actual portal. You can see that I've got multiple subscriptions and I've got my management group that I'm going to jump into. And in here, you're going to see that hierarchy I was talking about. I have the tenant root management group that has sub 1 assigned to it. Below that, I've got demo and prod. By default, because sub1 is assigned to tenant root, both of these would be able to build things to that sub1 subscription. I'm going to drill down, and you can see under demo I've got my subscription number 2, and you can add or remove these. It's pretty easy to do that. You can even rename them. I'm going to go into tenant root management group, and it gives me the option to actually rename the group. So if you said you wanted to use this as, you know, something more realistic in your organization, you could do that. I'm not going to go through all 7 layers of this to see how deep you can go, but as I said, fairly flexible for what you want it to work with. Now I'm going to come in and take a look at a term called access control, or IAM, Identity Access Management. The term that we often use, and I'll be using, is called RBAC, or the Role-Based Access Control. This is where we're going to be able to control what happens, because I want to show you that inheritance feature. So from the tenant root at the very top, I can take a look at the role assignments that have been assigned to the tenant root. You can see that as an owner, we're going to cover this in another recording, I've got Juliet and a series of other roles that have been assigned to it. So you saw that we had access control at the tenant root management group. I'm going to come into a resource. I'm going to go down to a resource inside of a resource group, and we can see that it will inherit things from its parent. So I'm going to go back into the access control, the role assignments, and you'll see that that Juliet was inherited from the root that I showed you. So that came from the tenant root management group. Some came from a subscription. If I scroll down here, you'll see that some actually potentially come from the actual resource group itself. Now I'm going to go in, I'm going to create a cost center tag on this object. I'm going to then go to the parent object, create a different tag, and you'll see that it's not inherited down. In a future recording, we'll show you a thing called policies, which you can use to enforce tagging, which is one of the reasons why you might do that, because tags are not inherited. Permissions are, and I'm also going to show you at the same time a lock capability. We don't talk about it in the class, but it's one that you might want to put on for an administration. So let me go into here. You'll see that there's no locks associated with this resource. It's a firewall resource. I'm going to go back to the resource group and create a tag. Cost center 01551. Apply. I'm going to then come into the locks. I'm going to add a lock, read, but not delete. It's a read-only lock. So I've got a lock that I created at the resource. So I'm going to go back to the resource inside of it. I'm going to come to that firewall. And you'll see that the tag for the cost center isn't there. It didn't get inherited. And if I come down to the locks, you'll see it does have the read but not delete lock as a read-only that came from the scope of the resource group above it. So just showing you some of those features on how inheritance happens all the way down through. We can also then work with subscriptions and the billing constructs that you're working with. So in this module, we looked at a number of the variety of the main resources within the architecture and the hierarchy that you build inside of Azure. We saw that we started with the different types of Azures themselves, the public Azure, which we focused on. We then went into the regions that make up the Azure environment. We saw a feature called region pairs, which is a way to provide high availability that is managed by Microsoft. We saw that we had management groups with inside of your tenant that you could then use to have from an organizational perspective with over 10,000 management groups at 7 layers deep to build that hierarchy from an org structure perspective. You can then assign one or more of your subscriptions from a billing construct. They have several varieties of subscriptions, a pay-as-you-go, a free, a student, an enterprise agreement, or a CSP or cloud solution partner that might get you the subscription that you could then build those resources to. We saw that we had resource groups to group objects together in a variety of ways, whichever way you want, but Microsoft recommends that you group them based around objects that have that common life cycle. We saw that you could put locks, not part of the actual class, to prevent objects from being potentially changed or deleted with the lock. You then also have the capability of being able to have cost centers up to 50 objects or attributes of a tag, and you can have hundreds of different tags, but only 50 of that group of potential hundreds that could be assigned to any one. Permissions are inherited, locks are inherited, but tags are not. Thanks for joining us for this session. To continue your learning, watch other videos in the course or explore more on Microsoft Learn at aka.ms/learn.